The first time I noticed it, the silence, was during a damp November evening in the countryside of Wiltshire.
Side of Wiltshire. Fog rolled in from the River Avon, weaving ghostly tendrils between the ancient oaks lining the manor road. I had come to visit my grandfather, Sir Edmund Langley, a man of severe countenance and meticulous habits, whose presence in a room was felt even before he entered. He rarely spoke of his past, a fact I had accepted as part of his peculiar dignity. But that evening, something in his eyes, flickering like candlelight against the shadows, suggested there was a story buried deep beneath the layers of his silence. I had always admired him. Even as a boy, I sensed his gravitas. He was a man who read newspapers with furrowed brows, who polished his silver every Sunday without fail, and who kept his garden in such impeccable order that each rose seemed to bloom out of discipline rather than nature. Yet for all his precision, there were gaps in his narrative, holes in the story of his life. Stories of war, of London and the Blitz, of his travels abroad. He never spoke of these. Even when pressed, he would only smile faintly, as if the memory itself were a private treasure he could not part with. I remember that night vividly. I had arrived at the manor under a dull drizzle, the wind carrying the scent of wet earth and burning wood from distant chimneys. The manor was a sprawling Georgian house built of honey-colored stone with ivy climbing its walls in a determined embrace. I had come to spend the weekend, ostensibly to enjoy the countryside and the quiet, but secretly I hoped for a glimpse of the man behind the austere mask. Dinner was served in the grand dining room, a chamber lined with portraits of stern-looking ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow our every movement. My grandfather, seated at the head of the table, carved the roast with a precision that bordered on ritual. The meal passed in polite conversation, discussions of the weather, of village news, of minor scandals in the local papers. But the silence lingered around him like a cloak, dense and impenetrable. After dinner, as the fire crackled and threw flickering shadows across the room, I found the courage to ask a question that had haunted me for years. "Grandfather," I said, my voice unusually hesitant, "you've never told me much about your time in London during the war or about your travels to India and Africa. What was it like?" He paused, the carving knife still in his hand, eyes narrowing as if measuring my maturity, my patience, or perhaps my audacity. Then, without a word, he placed the knife down, stood, and walked to the window. Outside, the fog had thickened and the lanterns along the drive cast an eerie, wavering light. "I suppose some truths," he said finally, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, "are not meant for young ears." I felt a familiar knot of frustration in my stomach. But there was something in the way he spoke, a subtle tremor, a hint of unease that told me this was more than mere discretion. There was a burden he carried, one that had shaped him in ways I could not yet understand. That night sleep eluded me. I wandered the manor's long corridors, the creak of the wooden floors echoing under my feet. I paused outside the study where the door was slightly ajar and smelled the faint scent of tobacco and old leather. Inside, my grandfather sat hunched over his writing desk, a dim lamp casting a golden circle around him. He did not notice me. On the desk lay a pile of letters tied with a faded ribbon and a small leather-bound journal. Curiosity overpowered caution. I stepped inside, hesitated, and then picked up the journal. The leather was soft under my fingers, worn by decades of handling. The first page bore his neat, deliberate handwriting. "To whomever finds this, what follows is the story I have kept silent for too long. Perhaps it is time someone knew." I was stunned. My grandfather had never allowed anyone to touch his personal papers, and yet here it was, an open invitation into the very heart of his secret. I turned the pages and slowly a life I had never imagined began to unfold. The journal spoke of his youth in London, of his father's untimely death, and of a mother whose grief shaped every word he ever wrote or spoke. But then the entries took a darker turn. During the Blitz, he had been involved in clandestine operations, assisting in the evacuation of children from bombed-out boroughs. He wrote of courage and fear, of friends lost in firebombs, and of a decision he had made that would haunt him for decades. It was in India that the most astonishing revelation lay. My grandfather had, in his early 20s, worked with local scholars and archaeologists, unearthing manuscripts that contained knowledge considered forbidden by colonial authorities. Among them were letters and codices describing a secret society, one that wielded influence over both commerce and politics. My grandfather had been entrusted with protecting these documents, a task that demanded absolute discretion. The silence he had maintained, I realized, was a shield, one designed not just for himself but for the countless others implicated by these revelations. As I read, I felt a mix of awe and disbelief. My grandfather, the man who had seemed so ordinary, had led a life of extraordinary consequence. Each entry drew me deeper, the words alive with danger and duty. There were accounts of narrow escapes, of coded messages hidden in innocuous letters, and of alliances formed in shadows. And throughout it all, one truth emerged unmistakably. His silence was a form of protection, a barrier erected to safeguard lives, reputations, and perhaps history itself. The final pages of the journal were the hardest to read. They spoke of a betrayal by a trusted friend and of a choice my grandfather had made that cost him deeply. He had turned away from recognition, from fame, even from family in order to preserve the secret. His life, he admitted, had been a life half-lived in the public eye, fully lived only in the service of a principle few could understand. I remember sitting by the fire long after midnight, the journal trembling in my hands, tears streaming down my cheeks. The man I had known, stern, distant, impenetrable, was not merely my grandfather. He was a guardian of truths I could barely comprehend, a silent sentinel who had sacrificed comfort and companionship to keep a world from chaos. The next morning, over breakfast, I confronted him. "Grandfather," I said quietly, "I found your journal. I know now why you never spoke." He looked at me with the same penetrating gaze, and for the first time I saw vulnerability there, a shadow beneath the weight of years. He did not deny it. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You are wiser than I thought," he said. "Some truths, sod, are heavy, they can break the unprepared, but now perhaps it is time the silence ends." What followed was a series of conversations unlike any I had shared with him before. He recounted events with a careful blend of candor and discretion, revealing pieces of the past I had only glimpsed in the journal. He spoke of friendships forged in secrecy, of the moral dilemmas he faced, of the quiet courage required to remain unseen in acts that mattered profoundly. Weeks later, I left Wiltshire with a new understanding of the man I had always admired but never truly known. His silence, I realized, was not absence, it was presence, the presence of responsibility, of conscience, of love, of fear, and of sacrifice. Years have passed since that weekend, yet the lessons linger. I have come to see that silence is not always emptiness. Sometimes it is a fortress built to protect, to preserve, to endure. And sometimes, when the time is right, it opens to reveal a truth so profound that it changes not just the listener but the world they inhabit. On the eve of his 90th birthday, I returned once more to the manor. The fog had lifted, and the gardens were alive with the delicate hum of early spring. My grandfather greeted me with his usual quiet dignity, but in his eyes there was a light I had not seen before. "Do you understand now?" he asked, handing me a sealed envelope. Inside were copies of the manuscripts he had safeguarded in India, letters of introduction to scholars he trusted, and detailed instructions on how to preserve the knowledge for future generations. "I trust you," he said. "Now it is yours to bear, not with silence but with wisdom." I left Wiltshire that day with a heart full of gratitude and a mind alive with purpose. My grandfather's silence had hidden a truth that changed my life forever, not merely because of the secrets themselves, but because of the courage it took to remain silent until the right moment. And as I drive through the English countryside, the hills rolling gently under a pale sky, I feel his presence beside me. Not in words, not in stories told, but in the enduring weight of integrity, the quiet power of restraint, and the profound knowledge that sometimes, the greatest truths are those we choose to protect until the world is ready to hear them. In the end, I understood what it meant to inherit not just wealth or title, but legacy. And I vowed, as my grandfather had, to honor it with courage, discretion, and when necessary, silence. For some truths once spoken cannot be taken back, but the ones kept patiently with wisdom and care can change lives forever.